Hello, everyone. All right, this is part one of the obesity lecture. All right, the term obesity comes from the Latin meaning to overeat, but as you're going to see throughout this presentation, it is a lot more complicated than simple overeating. Many of you have heard of the body mass index chart for adults, and let's go ahead and move in. I'm sure many of you are like critiquing BMI in your head already. Obesity is defined as being 20% above normal weight or 10 to 20% above normal body fat. And body mass index is a very commonly used measure. I've used it in my research before. And the metric is weight in kilograms over height in meters squared. But I think many of you already know that there are lots of issues measuring body weight with body mass index or BMI. And so let's talk a little bit about the Center for Disease Control has cutoffs for BMI, where BMI of 25 is considered to be overweight, 30 is considered to be obese, and then 35 is considered to be morbidly obese. But again, it's more complicated than that. However, height and weight are easy to measure. And that's why we oftentimes will use BMI in healthcare and we will use BMI in research. I have oftentimes in my research asked people just to self-report height and weight. It's a better research if you get them into a lab and you actually do those measurements. The problem with BMI, however, is it only correlates at zero point 0.7 with body fat. And the way you look at variance with the correlation is you square it. So 7 times 7 is 49. So BMI only captures about 50% of the variance in a person's over fatness. We also know, complicating things even more, where a person stores their body fat on their body is also a predictor of health, or if you flip it, risks for morbidity, which is illness, or risk for mortality. We know that the android, where a person stores their body fat, men or women, if they store body fat in their midriff, that tends to be more dangerous body fat than what is called gynoid, which is associated with a little bit more of a female shape of storing fat in the thighs and the booty. That's actually less dangerous body fat. Um, Another way that we take a look at risk is the waist to hip ratio. And ideally, in terms of health, the waist to hip ratio is less than one. So you're seeing here, her hips are larger than her waist. So her waist to hip ratio is less than one. You'll see right here, this individual, her waist is larger than her hip. So her waist to hip ratio would be greater than one, which is riskier. Another metric that we use at times is the waist to height ratio. So you're looking at waist relative to height. And actually, that's a more precise metric when we're predicting illness and when we are predicting mortality. So BMI is commonly used, but it's got lots of issues. And these are metrics that we know are better scientific predictors when we're looking at illness. Okay. When we look at prevalence, the NHANES, the latest survey is this is National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and this is conducted by federal government on a regular basis, and it tracks all kinds of different things relative to nutrition. We are currently in the United States with children and our teenagers, 15% are classified as overweight, but separate from that, 21% of our young people are classified as obese. When it comes to adults, we've got other metrics that it's even higher. 32% of adults are overweight, and then separate from that, 40%, and we're at an all-time high, of our adults are classified as obese. If you look here in the last 30 years, in 1990, and then we've got percentage of individuals who are obese as these colors get more pronounced here. We had very little in terms of the United States um, that were classified as obese, but by 2018, look at how serious we've got. So if you take North Carolina over here, I'm not sure what those orange lines are right in the middle. 30 to 35% of people in the South and North Carolina are classified as obese. So we have seen across time, and we're an all-time prevalence in terms of larger bodies in the United States, we have seen an increase in obesity. We call the curve when you look at BMI increasing and you look at risk for mortality, which is death rates over here. You see what is called a J-shaped curve, where it looks like this for men and for women. And what we see, the healthiest, the lowest mortality rates are at a BMI of around 24. And then you see an acceleration in the curve, particularly an acceleration after 30 and then 35. And then again, CDC classifies obesity right here, but it's pretty low on the curve. And then morbid obesity at 35. But I want to point out over here, under 20, you have a increase, and actually right down in here, where at 23, you start to see an increase in mortality rate. And I want to talk about what's going on down here. In some of these situations, you've got an individual with an eating disorder who has starved themselves and is at a much lower BMI than most of the population. What you've also got going on down here, and I know many of you have probably experienced this with family members, that oftentimes in older age, when individuals have serious illness, you start to see some body wasting, which is really hard. If you've ever had a family member go through that, it's really hard to see somebody being much smaller and fragile looking than they used to be when they were younger and healthier. So some of that is going on down here. So I just want to emphasize some things like BMI alone is an imperfect metric. We saw that in the last slide. Waist circumference and visceral fat. Visceral fat is actually, so we talked about abdominal fat being more dangerous than fat in the thighs and in the buttocks. Visceral fat is actually fat that's inside the belly. So as opposed to like a mushroom effect of fat being on the outside of the belly, fat that's inside of the belly, where it starts to look like, imagine a male who starts to look like there's a pregnancy going on. That's visceral fat where it's inside the abdomen and it's pressing on internal organs. That's even more dangerous than the external fat on the belly, above the belly. We know, and you're going to hear this theme all throughout this lecture. If we have a metric that captures health or captures risk for illness, it's actually fitness, not body size, not body fat, and definitely not BMI. And one of the simplest measures of fitness, and I know we got exercise science majors here in the audience, but one of the more simple measures is resting heart rate right when you wake up before you get up and move around and have food and coffee and all that kind of stuff. The lower your heart rate is in the morning is an indicator of better fitness, and fitness is going to happen through physical activity and exercise. We also know, just another cautionary note here, metabolic health varies substantially within BMI categories. I'm going to see a little bit later. You can be in a larger body and fit and very healthy. And I know that's going to contrast with what a lot of you have in your belief system, but that's going to be a theme that we hear throughout this lecture. Okay, now let's talk about morbidity. Rates have to do with illness. So in morbidity, we're talking about, do people have a disease? In mortality, we're talking about death rates. So two different epidemiological metrics. We know that you have this J-shaped curve that we keep talking about as a risk for hypertension, as risk for high cholesterol, particularly LDL and triglycerides, stuff like that. We have that J-shaped, same J-shaped curve for type 2 diabetes, and I've got a whole lecture, in this class on diabetes. Osteoarthritis, gout, risk for gallbladder disease, sleep apnea. A lot of individuals in larger bodies struggle with sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, and need a CPAP and things like fatty liver. Higher surgical complications that follows that J-shaped curve, cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular accidents, which we usually call stroke, problems in with reproduction, and then certain cancer risks are higher in individuals with obesity, and you see that J-shaped curve, colon cancer, kidney cancer, esophageal, uterine and breast cancer, so the hormone-fed cancers. Some of this has to do with fat cells releasing hormones, but it's more complicated than that. This is just a graph over here to taking a look at the cancer risks that follow that J-shaped curve and really accelerate with higher levels of obesity. Some reproduction complications you see in both larger body males and females, more problems with infertility, problems getting pregnant when they desire to be pregnant. Some of the maternal pregnancy complications. And again, a lot of this is lack of fitness. It's not just larger bodies. And in some cases, it can be even how the individual is eating. You see more gestational diabetes, so diabetes that begins during pregnancy, more hypertensive and high blood pressure issues, preeclampsia or toxemia is a risk factor. And that can be fatal for mom, fatal for baby if baby's not born yet. And so these are pregnancies that are considered to be high risk and are followed very carefully by obstetricians. More likely to need cesarean delivery, more likely to have problems with sleep apnea during pregnancy, more blood clotting disorders, thromboembolisms, and more risk for hemorrhaging or bleeding upon delivery. So some serious risk factors there. For the fetus and neonatal complications that we sometimes see, larger birth weight. And you're likely to see, I talk about this in the diabetes lecture, when mom gets gestational diabetes, she's more likely to continue to have type 2 diabetes or at more risk for getting type 2 diabetes if it resolves postpartum. But her baby is going to be likely larger at full term birth, and that baby is going to be more at risk for developing diabetes. More congenital anomalies are found in these high-risk pregnancies, more likely to have a preterm birth. Some of that has to do with these larger babies. The body can kind of recognize when you're getting to a place where if you're going to birth that baby vaginally, you might go into preterm labor before that baby gets too big. But now that we're doing all kinds of C-sections, babies have gotten bigger, our heads have gotten bigger. It's one of those places where evolution is not killing, which is a good thing, is not killing moms when they're having large babies nowadays because we perform a C-section to get that baby out of there, whereas that baby may not have made it through the birth canal if that baby was that large without a C-section. So mom would have died if baby gets stuck in the birth canal. More likely to have a stillbirth, which is a terrible tragedy to birth a baby that is not living. More likely to need intensive care, NICU admission, and then higher risk for childhood obesity. So lots of complications here. Okay, let's talk about metabolic syndrome. This is really in where we should be focusing on diagnostically as opposed to those clean cutoffs that the Center for Disease Control has in BMI. Metabolic syndrome is diagnosed if an individual has 3 out of 5 of these. And it really is once an individual in a larger body has metabolic syndrome, that's really what we should be trying to prevent. And that's really what we should be trying to treat to prevent other morbidities and then eventually risk for death. A larger waistline, we've already talked about that waist to hip ratio. For men, that means 40 inches and above. Women tends to be 35 inches and above. Higher triglycerides, which are a particular type of blood fat. Lower levels of high density lipoprotein, which is considered to be the good cholesterol. We want our HDL levels to be higher. I've always remembered this as we want high density lipoproteins, the H to be higher, and we want low density lipoproteins to be lower. The LDL is the bad. High blood pressure. And we can diagnose high blood pressure gets counted in metabolic syndrome if you're untreated for hypertension. High blood pressure is a risk factor, or if you are taking high blood pressure medication to keep your blood pressure down. So if we did a reading, your blood pressure is normal. That's a good thing. But we count this if you're on meds to take care of that. Same thing for high fasting blood glucose, or if you're taking medications like metformin to bring down your glucose levels. And we usually will start to diagnose this at a fasting. You do not you do not diagnose high glucose levels when somebody has just eaten a meal. So high fasting glucose levels at 100 milligrams a deciliter higher. And we know when people have three out of these five, they have twice the risk of coronary heart disease. So that's going to be risk for stroke or risk for heart attack, five times the risk for developing type 2 diabetes. And we know that close to 40% of adults in the United States have this. Behavioral risk factors for metabolic syndrome. And again, this is why, I keep critiquing BMI. We really need to be looking at a person's health behavior. And I've already told you that fitness, which is going to be a function of our physical activity or our exercise, is the cleanest measure of taking a look at consequences, regardless of a person's body size. So the behavioral risk factors, physical inactivity, consumption of excess calories, having poor sleep, having more stress, a person who's consuming nicotine, a person who's consuming excess levels of alcohol. Genetic risk factors are going to play a factor here. And then older age is going to be some behavioral risk factors for metabolic syndrome. Okay. Now, some of you have heard of this, but I'm going to predict that most of you in this audience have not heard about this controversy. And it's fascinating. We've got several researchers over in the nutrition department that do research on this. We have several researchers, including myself and Dr. Sandoval in my department, who do research on both sides of this. The controversy here, what most people know about and is ingrained in their belief system, lay people as well as a lot of healthcare workers, and we're really trying to work on some of these healthcare workers and plant the seed that there's controversy here. So a lot of scientists, a lot of the medical model, and then our media, like social media and just healthcare media, really likes to camp out over here on this side. And the saying over here is overweight and obesity is unhealthy. And overweight is the gateway to obesity. So all of this, we've got the stigma attached to larger bodies. And most Americans really kind of like internalize that stigma and then they project that stigma onto others. It's that, okay, it's simply unhealthy. And therefore, individuals who are obese or even overweight, because that's the gateway, remember, we need to help these individuals lose weight in order to be healthy. Okay. That is a belief that is very common in our culture. Again, lay people and a lot of healthcare providers. The flip side of that in that controversy is that it's really about our health behavior, about our fitness, about our eating, about our stress levels, about our body image. And there are a couple of organizations here, the fat acceptance movement. These individuals really embrace the term fat because they say that is a characteristic of larger bodies that have more body fat than bodies that are thin and leaner. But there's a movement to just simply accept that people come in all shapes, sizes, and colors and body sizes. Another organization over here, and I really embrace Hayes, Health at Every Size, is the idea whether you are in a low body fat body or a body that has lots of body fat. Health at Every Size really tends to focus on not only fat acceptance, but you can, if you engage in the health behaviors, if you engage in physical activity and you engage in healthy eating and you engage in stress management, on and on and on in terms of self care, your body can be healthy regardless of body size. And this side of the controversy, in defense of this side, says the risks of overweight are overrated. You kind of saw that in the J-shaped curve. And it's really only once an individual is morbidly obese that it becomes unhealthy. But I want us to back up at morbid obesity when we're talking like BMIs 40 and above. Usually those individuals are not engaging in the health behaviors. Okay. That's a very special population if you take a look at that. This side also says, you know what, over here you say, let's just simply help them lose weight and they will get healthier. But when you look at the science, nothing has really worked. We have been really poor at helping people lose weight and keep it off. We have been much better in the healthcare field and even in the supplement field and the drug field, medication field, at helping people lose weight. We have been terrible at helping people keep weight off long term. So there tends to be in science, like you can't get anything published nowadays if you've got a new drug or you've got a new fitness routine or you've got a new way of eating or whatever it might be, and you do research and you're able to show that you can create weight loss with whatever X is. You have got to be following up your participants in your research study long term because you've got to be able to show that you can help them keep that weight off in order to ethically and scientifically say, hey, this thing works. Okay. What also has happened when we embrace this side and we do whatever it is for young people or adults to help them lose weight, and then you stop doing whatever that thing is, the medication, the program, whatever, and you create yo-yo dieting, we have found in human and in animal models, when you yo-yo diet, meaning you lose weight and then you stop whatever it is, and that person regains weight, and then they get upset because they gain weight, and then they go back down. You create, again, in animal models, like with mice and with humans, those individuals end up fatter and larger in the long run, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to lose weight. And I want us to think about that. That makes a lot of sense when you think about human evolution, because our problem in evolution, obesity is only a recent problem in human history. The big problem in human history has been starvation. And so it makes a lot of sense that if you have gone through a period of starvation and you have lost weight, your body is motivated to not only regain that weight and get back to health, but maybe store a little bit of extra fat on that next round of regain, because that extra fat is going to do you a lot of good when the next famine comes around. Okay, so mammals are oftentimes wired. I'm going to talk about genetic risk here in a second. That yo-yo dieting ends up creating poorer health in the long run. So these people over here would say, why can't we just accept these larger body sizes and focus on health behavior? Why are we trying to help people lose weight, assuming that that is going to be some panacea and really correct all of these problems. What we also get over here is there's all kinds of stigma. And we know that internalized stigma about larger bodies is really dangerous for individuals. And we've got all kinds of externalized stigma in our culture about larger bodies. And that stigma tends to drive poor body image. And poor body image into individuals drives lower self-esteem. It tends to drive depression. It tends to drive anxiety. And we know we've done a lot of research in my lab on this kind of stuff. It drives eating disorders. So huge controversy here, you all. Okay. I've already kind of admitted that I'm over here. Now, I'm certainly following the science and I'm following the healthcare. But I feel like the data in the science aligns better over here despite the fact that most lay people and a lot of healthcare workers are still aligned over here. So how do we reconcile? How do we reconcile this controversy? I reconcile the controversy in a lot of individuals who fall over on this side, reconcile it with health behavior, that it's really about physical activity and it's really about healthful eating and it's really about stress management and it's really about striving to have good, healthy body image. So Health at Every Size. You can check it out. I follow Health at Every Size on Facebook as an example and social media, and it is amazing to me. Well, it doesn't surprise me how many individuals participate and post in Hayes on media like Facebook about healthcare discrimination at how, like, let's say, their kid had strep throat and they go in to see a healthcare provider complaining, hey, my throat's on fire. And they leave there having been advised by their healthcare provider that they need to lose weight. When they were in there to get their throat swabbed and get an antibiotic for strep throat, they will complain that not only medical providers discriminate and are too preachy about that kind of stuff, and then they even complain about their counselors or their psychotherapists and how often those individuals are stigmatizing them unnecessarily because of their body size. So very sad. We got lots of future healthcare providers in this class. I hope you will contemplate this if you've never heard about this controversy in both sides, because I think all of us can be better healthcare professionals if we check our biases at the door. And I think we could all be better healthcare providers if we really stop emphasizing body size and we really start emphasizing talking with individuals and counseling individuals on health behavior. I did a book review of what's called What's Wrong with Fat. And I've got a little story that I really appreciated. Dr. Sagai's, she's a professor of sociology and gender studies at UCLA. She wrote this book. And the What's Wrong with Fat, she did a deep, deep dive into the science on the fact that we are stigmatizing uh, body sizes in the United States. But I do want to talk about, there are a couple of things when she talked about some personal things in her life as she was writing this book. She was pregnant when she went to a Health at Every Size conference. And she talks about how in her pregnancy, when she was feeling larger than her normal self, and she ascribes to being an individual who has thin privilege. Um, and it got me thinking about, different biases in life and different privileges that we tend to have. And lean people tend not to think about fat stigma because they're not encountering it necessarily in their lives. Now, I've worked with individuals who had larger bodies and then they had smaller bodies and talked about, like, whoa, I was treated very differently by people when my body was larger. And now being leaner, or vice versa, in how people are stigmatized. So she's pregnant. She goes to this conference and she talks about how when she left for the conference, she was feeling huge in her pregnancy with her baby bump. When she returned from the conference, she was like, oh, this is just a really tiny baby bump. I really don't have this large body because at the conference, she was mingling with all of these individuals who were doing scientific presentation, but all these individuals who had larger bodies. And she also made an observation, she writes about it in her book. There was an afternoon in the conference where she wasn't attending different presentations or presenting or that kind of thing, where she went to the hotel pool. And she found it really interesting at the hotel pool because she had not observed this before. All of these men that came to the conference, some of the men had larger bodies and some of the men had what we would consider to be muscular, lean bodies, came to the pool because they were deliberately attracted to women in larger bodies. And she talks about in this one scene, this younger man is at the pool and he's hanging out the side of the pool and he starts flirting with this woman. And then there's some hooking up that's going on in this particular couple. And there's a point where she's on his lap on the side of the pool. And then she gets really interested in researching individuals who are deliberately attracted to larger bodies, and they exist. The cultural stigma suggests, like, how could anybody love a fat body? Do note, I read a book at one point in time. There's even like fat pornography, because there are lots of individuals out there who are really attracted to these larger bodies. Let's talk a little bit about Viren Swami's research. He's English. He's edited some of my work that has been published in the journal Body Image before. And in this particular study, we're looking at BMI down here. He deliberately recruited men that identify as being male fat admirers. And these are heterosexual men who are attracted to women with larger bodies. And keep in mind that some of these men are larger themselves, and some of these men, by our standards, would be considered to be lower body sizes. And he has found that if you look at men who do not identify as fat admirers, that they tend to like women with BMIs that are a little bit less than 20 is where that peaks. And keep in mind, in a lot of situations, the BMI below 20 is actually signaling younger female bodies, more fertile female bodies, and more fertile female bodies that have not yet had pregnancies, because a lot of women, their BMI is going to increase permanently following the birth of a child. The fat admirers, on the other hand, you see right here, they really start finding women attractive when their BMI is over 30. And in some cases, they really find women to be attractive when their body mass index is over 40. So back to that idea of, can we find cultural acceptance? There are people out there who really are attracted to larger bodies. Okay. Okay. This is my book, Fat Talk, and one of the chapters, I spent a lot of time looking at fat stigma in our culture and researching the science on this. And you'll have bits and pieces of this kind of work throughout the semester. But the thing that I found to be really interesting, fat talk is when people complain about their bodies, oftentimes complaining about their body fat, but it could be other kinds of appearance things of like, I don't like my hair, I don't like my eyes, that kind of stuff. Complaining, and it's usually women complaining to other women. That's fat talking. And nowadays we've changed our terminology a lot in the research. Been working on a chapter with my colleague recently, and we're calling it negative body talk instead of fat talk, because the fat talk kind of owns some of the fat stigma. So the fat talking is when it happens within individuals and it's about themselves. The body snarking is a really pernicious and sometimes even vicious way of taking somebody else down. So body snarking is when we fat shame others or we weight tease others. And the fat shaming and the weight teasing, women and girls are more likely to be victims of that than boys and men. I even write about in the chapter how when men versus women are running against one another in politics, the man is usually asked by media about his accomplishments and his goals if he were to get into office. for legislation and for change. The women are oftentimes, and this is really sad to me and really upsetting to me, are oftentimes by the media, even when they're running for political office, they are critiqued for their body and their attraction. We saw this when Hillary Clinton was running for different offices, including president, as an example. She was critiqued so often about her body size and the clothes she wore, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a way, the body snarking is a way of cutting somebody else down, oftentimes simply because of their weight. And the whole snarking embeds within the fat stigma within our culture. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about weight stigma. There is all kinds of really interesting science on this. One of the articles that I really liked is the idea if fat shaming worked. Like, so we tease somebody or we shame them, which is, again, very common, more common targeting females. If fat shaming worked, because there's so much fat shaming going on in our culture, if it worked, there would be no fat people, because this is very painful to be the recipient of this for individuals with larger bodies. And if that kind of stinging stigma targeting those individuals, if it was motivation for them to lose weight and get smaller bodies, a lot of people would have done it. Okay. The problem is fat shaming and being the recipient of that oftentimes backfires. Rebecca Puhl, she's up at Yale, has done some really interesting research. And she has found that being the target of weight stigma, you would think that would predict weight loss and smaller bodies, but it actually backfires for most people. It is painful to be the recipient of any type of prejudice and bias and stigma. And it actually is a predictor of more weight gain, not weight loss. So people who report being the recipient of more of this tend to be gaining more weight and not losing weight. One of the mechanisms there is it tends to be a predictor of yo-yo dieting. Okay. Somebody's the recipient, they want to lose weight, they lose weight, they regain the weight. It's a predictor of binge eating for some individuals. And we know that about 40% of adults are discriminated against due to their weight, but you see the discrimination being much higher in women than we see it being in men. And that we even know is a predictor of socioeconomic status for women. As an example, it's harder for fat women compared to fat men to be hired in a job. It is harder. You see fat women tend to have less higher education than leaner women or fat men. And then you see once in the workforce, fat women are a lot less likely to get promoted and to rise to higher salaries than fat men or leaner women. So this discrimination runs really deep, and it tends to actually keep larger bodied individuals into lower socioeconomic status, as opposed to rising above in socioeconomic status, but especially for women. And other research by this team, weight stigma is linked to poor health. But when you take the variance of the actual body size out of that research, the stigma that is felt by individuals in larger bodies, the link between poor health is independent from their actual body size. So that fat stigma really does harm individuals, which is why the fat acceptance movement, the health at every size movement, has really tried to target stigma as opposed to helping people lose weight. If we covered this in epidemiology, and we covered Bloom's criteria for taking research that is not the true scientific experiment, and we look at the body of research and we see if it meets all of these Bloom's taxonomy and criteria, we do not have causality. Obesity does not cleanly predict illness and mortality. And again, it's because unless we factor in health behaviors, we're not going to see clean prediction. We do not have consistency across the scientific research. We're going to talk in a minute about larger bodies, if they are fit, are healthier than lean bodies that are not fit. The strength of the association, it's a small strength association, and the reason it's only small is because it's not specific. You've got to look at those health behavior metrics and not just simply BMI as a predictor. Um, the temporal association, you do see larger bodies tend to come first before you start to see illness. So we've got a little bit of that. We've got a little bit of the biological plausibility on some level. Like we talked about the fat cells releasing certain hormones. And we know that larger bodies, once you develop metabolic syndrome, as an example, then it becomes easier to gain more weight. As opposed to lose weight post metabolic syndrome. But in a lot of places, the biological plausibility just it's not strong. It's not holding. There's other things going on. As an example, a person who exercises on a regular basis tends to have glucose levels that stay within that normal range and don't go higher because of physical activity. Their body is using that glucose and using body fat for energy, as an example. So in some cases, the biological plausibility is just not clean cut. Coherence, yeah, there's correlations there, but again, correlations don't predict causality. And then the prevention trials is really interesting here. In prevention trials, you would take individuals who had obesity and you would be randomly assigning, do nothing with one group, that's a control group, do intervention with the other group where you help them lose weight. And then you compare the two groups in their health metrics. The problem with the idea of prevention trials, like I've said, we've done really good work at helping people lose weight. We have done so poorly at helping people keep the weight off over time that we just don't cleanly, the prevention trials don't work. So we just can't make some of those comparisons long term because we haven't helped people lose weight and keep it off. To highlight that point a little bit more, let's talk a little bit about the etiology or the science of why obesity happens. And I've already alluded to this already. In terms of human evolution, the problem has been starvation and death. The problem has not been health consequences of larger bodies. Again, it's only very recent in human history, in the last 100 years, that larger bodies have become associated with health risks and has become a problem. And if you look across the globe in what has created survival for Homo sapiens, the human species, we have multiple genes, about 30 to 80% of larger bodies is predicted by our genetics. And scientists have identified 97 loci that are identified in predicting larger bodies, and 49 of those loci identified predicting our waist to hip ratio. And it makes a lot of sense that we've got all these different genes all across the globe as people have evolved because it was adaptive to store body fat for the next famine and starvation. Okay. And it makes sense. There's so many different genes all across the globe. And if you think about it, there's certain cultures and certain races that in certain locations across the world, where you tend to see larger bodies because they have evolved to have more of those multiple genes because of that adaptation in evolution. If we take identical twins who have the exact same genes and they were separated at birth and raised in different environments, we don't do that anymore. Most cultures, if you've got twins, whether they're fraternal twins or identical twins, we tend to, in adoptions, make sure that they stay together. And there's some important social reasons for that. But if we look at identical twins in this research that were reared apart, and you'll see this is kind of dated because we don't do this anymore, the correlation is 0.74. So if we want to see shared variance, we square this. And if we square this, we're at about 50%. About 50% of a person's body size is predicted by their genetics, and about 50% is predicted by their environment. And the environment could involve the health behavior that they were raised to engage in, which is oftentimes predicted by parental and familiar behaviors. But we can also talk about environment as we know, as an example, certain environments are a lot more likely to promote larger body sizes and obesity as compared to other environments. We'll talk about the environments here in a little bit. One example, we've got a genetic variant in mice where we want to study, if we want animal models for studying obesity, the OB gene in mice are a lot more likely to become mice that are obese than if they don't have this particular gene, as an example. And if you think about the genotype being the actual genetic makeup versus the phenotype, do we see that gene or those multiple genes expressed in the environment? Expressed in the environment would mean in a phenotype, if you carry those genes, do you see it expressed and you see those larger bodies develop? Now, I want us to think about US culture and most industrialized cultures are environments that, based on the foods that are available and based on the fact that, like, we drive our cars to wherever we want to go, as opposed to, walking on foot or running on foot to get to the locations. It is really easy in our culture and our common environment to be very sedentary and to eat processed foods that are not as healthy for us as, say, whole foods or plant-based foods or that type of thing. It is really easy to sit at the computer all day long and be sedentary, or watch television and be sedentary. So many environmental factors are promoting if a person has the genotype for becoming the phenotype. One of the reasons why I think we're seeing 40% of people in the United States would be classified as obese is because a lot of people have inherited these multiple genes, and you plop those genes in an environment that's unhealthy in that way, you're gonna see the larger bodies. Now, I want to talk about this one particular study that I found to be fascinating, and makes me think about thin privilege, and how that is very different than the fat stigma that people experience in larger bodies. The National Weight Registry acknowledged that it is, just like we talked about in prevention trials here a little bit ago, it is really challenging to help people lose weight and keep it off. So the National Weight Registry, I think this was started at the University of Pittsburgh, they asked for participants out there, if you had a larger body and you lost weight and you kept that weight off, we want you to enroll in our study. So they captured these people who were the exceptions, okay? And they compared those individuals and they looked at their body mass index or their body sizes, and they found comparable control groups for all these different BMIs. And the comparable control group were individuals who had never had the larger bodies. They were just naturally at that BMI. So let's say you've got X amount of participants with the BMI of 30, and who had a BMI of 40 and they got down to 30. And then you take these people that have always been at 30, their body mass index or their size has not fluctuated, and you compare them on their lifestyle. You find that the people who lost weight and kept it off are usually not only engaging in regular exercise, in a lot of situations, they're engaging in very compulsive, excessive levels of exercise. But here's the thing I want to harp on right now. When you look at and it's really kilocalories, not calories. Really, when we talk about a calorie, we're talking about a kilocalorie. The group that lost weight and kept it off, so you would think their calorie needs, if their body sizes are the same, would be equivalent. But what they actually found is the people who lost weight and kept it off at a comparable body size, taking in 800 kilocalories less a day, every single day, to keep their weight suppressed. And I think about that in terms of gratitude and privilege. Like, I would not want to give up 800 kilocalories a day would be a very restrictive diet. And I think most of us in the audience thinking about like, gosh, no, we would not on a regular basis want to give up that much of our food. And so what I'm getting at is it's no wonder it is so challenging to help people lose weight and keep it off because we're talking about major food restriction here, 800 a day. Back to the genetics, there's so much going on. That's why the word obesity and the overeat is just really a simplification and doesn't get into the complications for all of this because there's a lot going on biologically in terms of what affects our satiety, which is when we're eating, how quickly we feel full. There's a lot going on in what makes us hungry. We got all kinds of insulin implications and how our pancreas is reacting to all kinds of different things. Even stress is going to create weight gain, as an example. And then we've got the whole second brain issue going on, all this that's going on in our gut biome and our intestinal bacteria. We even know that intestinal bacteria is going to predict if somebody's gaining weight or having difficulty losing weight in some situations. Or is normal weight. So there's just a lot biologically that's going on. It is really a lot more complicated than simple overeating. Okay, I'm going to make this part one and I'm going to stop the recording here. So you will want to jump over to part two here in a bit.